Hello and welcome to one more lecture of the Bilingual ao Vivo series. And this is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. And today it's we have a great pleasure to welcome Professor Janet van Hel. And she's a professor of psychology and linguistics at the Pennsylvania State University, and she's also a co-director of the Center for Language Science. She received her PhD from the University of Amsterdam in her Bilingualism and Language Development Lab, supported by the grants from the National Science Foundation. She and her postdoc and students use neurocognitive and behavioral techniques to study the neural and cognitive mechanisms involved in language processing in children and adults. And today, Professor van Hel is going to present a talk entitled Code Switching in Bilingual Speakers, Behavior and Electrophysiological Evidence. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you for this very nice introduction. It's really an honor to talk to this highly distinguished audience today. And yes, as already announced, I'm going to talk about some selected research from my lab that's focusing on code switching in bilingual speakers. And today we'll mainly look at behavioral and electrophysiological evidence. So code switching can be considered to be a hallmark of bilingual discourse. So when two bilinguals interact, we can hear them say something like "Voor heavens willen," or "And we reckoned Holland was too small for ons," or "Va chercher Marc and bribe him avec un chocolat chaud." So code switching is actually one of the very few natural phenomena that overtly reveals the interaction between two languages in the bilingual mind. So there's been a lot of research demonstrating that even when bilinguals speak in only one language, the other language is nevertheless active. But I'm now speaking to you in English and my native language is Dutch, but you can't tell whether my Dutch is active right now because hopefully I will not insert any Dutch words. But when one of my daughters comes in, we may actually switch back and forth between Dutch and English. So code switching actually overtly reveals that bilinguals have access to the two different language systems, and they can actually integrate these two different language systems. Now, in this merging of two different language systems into a coherent sentence that's very often following the grammatical structure of the two languages combined, actually reveals the flexibility of human speech. And it also demonstrates highly skilled cognitive control because this all happens in sort of a split second. Now that's true for people who are producing speech, but it's also true for people who are comprehending speech. Because if you're comprehending speech, there's not really a warning in the signal, or at least we think there's not really a warning in the signal that the speaker may switch to the other language. And still, as a listener, you're sort of confronted with this switch, and you still have to comprehend this sentence, even though you may have been building up the sentence structure in one particular language, and then you have to integrate the other language in order to still comprehend the language. So if you really think about it, cognitively, code switching is actually a very intriguing process. There's a lot going on, and quite a few of you may actually be code switch on a daily basis and not even realize the beauty of the cognitive processes that are involved in the production as well as the comprehension of code switch speech. Now, code switching has a very long tradition in linguistic research. And for decades, it has been and still is a highly popular research topic. So some researchers have looked at particular linguistic constraints that are associated with code switching, such as what has been termed the equivalence constraint by Potlek and her colleagues back in the 80s of the previous century, or congruency by Margaret Duker and her colleagues. Other theorists have developed or that's actually in particular Maya Scotten and her colleagues, the matrix language framework, or the 4M model. Klein has introduced, and it's later picked up by Bruce Mandelbrot, the triggering theory, the idea that the moment a speaker produces a word that's ambiguous across two different languages. So for example, a cognate that shares phonology, orthography, and semantics across languages, then speakers are more likely to code switch, as if the language ambiguous word has already co-activated the two languages and then triggers a switch to the other language. Researchers have also proposed generative approaches, such as the functional head constraint or the minimalist program. Social linguists have focused more on the social-cultural perspectives, and a very strong force in this research has been Peter Muysken. He has done phenomenal research, as well as Renato Torres and John Lipsky. And then there's also another aspect of social linguistics focuses more on the communication accumulation theory. So I'm not going to discuss each of these different perspectives in detail, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of other perspectives that have been developed to understand code switching. And these perspectives are more grounded in linguistic theories and research. So what I would like to do today is to give you a perspective from psycholinguistics and neurocognitive research on code switching. So to be honest, psycholinguists and neuroscientists joined the code switching literature at a later point than the linguists did. And they also started this interest from a slightly different perspective. So many psycholinguistic and neurocognitive studies looked at the processing costs that are or can be associated with language switching. So even though bilinguals self-report that code switching is an unconscious action, when you actually measure temporal aspects related to code switching, you can see that you can measure a measurable processing cost associated with code switching. So code switching occurs very fast. People may not even realize it, but if you actually scrutinize the signal, then you can pick up on, for example, a slowdown of the code switching signal, which is termed the code switching cost. Now, the cost in and of itself is not of high interest. You know, when people are switching back and forth between tasks, for example, that's also associated with a measurable cost. But what we would like to gain more insight into is, so what's driving these costs? What are the cognitive mechanisms that are associated with measurable delays associated with code switching, and can we find ways that mitigate these delays so that we can have a different perspective on the cognitive or neural aspects of code switching? So which factors modulate these switching costs? So psycholinguistic research on code switching actually started out with language switching tasks. They were used as some sort of a proxy to code switching, and this kind of research actually originated from the task switching literature, which is a true cognitive psychology domain. So what researchers have done is that they presented unrelated items that appear in isolation in a row. So research participants were presented with a series of unrelated pictures, unrelated words, or unrelated numbers. And then they were instructed in what language they had to name the stimuli, or were asked to process these stimuli for comprehension. So here's an example of this paradigm. So in this particular example, bilinguals are asked to name the numbers. And the colors surrounding the number indicates which language they have to name the number in. So for example, if this is a French English bilingual, then they start out naming this number in French, this number in French, then they switch to English, again stay in English, and then again they switch in French, and so forth. So the language they have to use is cued by this colored border, and then what you're measuring is the reaction time difference between a trial that switches from one language to the other and a trial that does not switch from one language to the other. And then the switching cost is calculated by subtracting the reaction time associated with the stay item or the non-switched item from the switched item. And this is a study, a classical study by Renate Moider and Alport that has used this digit naming task, and they observed switching costs. So let's first look at the non-switched trials versus the switched trials. This is response time, so basically the higher, the slower people are. And what you can see is that when people had to switch languages when naming these numbers, naming the number took longer than when they could stay in the same language. And this difference is called the switching cost. But you may see something interesting here. So this line indicates when people had to switch into the first language. The open dot indicates when people had to switch into the second language. And what you can see is that when people do not switch, they're typically faster in naming the number in their native language than in their second language. So a large majority of bilinguals are actually unbalanced bilinguals, not because they have some sort of mental issue, but because in the majority of people, not in all, and actually we'll discuss some people that are different later in my talk, but the majority of bilinguals are more fluent in their first language than in their second language, the first language being the native language. And that was also the case in the bilinguals tested in this particular study, in this classical study. So what you see is then when people do not switch, they're faster to name numbers in their native language than in their second language. But something interesting happens when they have to switch between languages. When they need to switch from the second language and name into the first language, they're actually slower than when they have on a switching trial to name into their second language, which is odd, right? Because these bilinguals are clearly more proficient in the first language. So why is it the case when on a switching trial, they go back to their native language? You would think, oh, great, that's my native language, I'm faster than it. No, it's the opposite. So they tend to be slower on switch trials when they have to switch into their first language relative to have to switch into your second language. And, excuse me. This is actually a very robust effect that has been replicated by many different, in many different studies using a wide variety of bilinguals with different languages. And it has been observed both in production and in tasks that ask people to comprehend the isolated items. So how can this be the case? The dominant explanation for why it apparently is more effortful to switch into your first language than to switch into your second language is related to activation of the two languages and inhibition. So in a typical unbalanced bilingual, the natural sort of state of the first language is that the first language is more active than the second language. So when your first language is more active than your second language, when you have performed in your second language in the switching trial, and you need, in order to optimize your performance, you need to inhibit this first language pretty effortlessly, right? Because the first language is the more active language. When you're performing your second language and you don't want this first language to interfere, you have to put in a lot of effort to inhibit the first language. Whereas because your second language is less active, you don't have to put in so much effort to inhibit your second language. So you're performing a task in your second language. You have to switch into your first language. You have been inhibiting your first language quite effortful. Then you have to switch into your first language. You have to release this inhibition. And releasing this inhibition is harder for the first language than it is for the second language, because you had so much effort inhibiting the first language in the first place. Okay, so the asymmetry in isolated item language switching has been related to an inhibition effect. And the fact that it's harder to release inhibition after you've inhibited your first language relative to the second language. I hope that makes sense. But some of you may have realized, well, I'm a code switcher myself, and this task doesn't look at all like the code switching that I'm doing on a daily basis. So after, or actually inspired by, but now in parallel to the isolated item switching studies, some psycholinguists have focused more on full sentences and how switching occurs when you're switching from one language to the other in a full-fledged sentence. So is that also accompanied by switching costs? So here I've highlighted some intra-sentential switching studies. So basically, they're presenting a sentence to the participants, and then halfway the sentence, the sentence switches into the other language. And some people have used behavioral measures, such as self-paced reading or shadowing. So I will demonstrate or highlight this research by discussing two studies. These were studies conducted by Sabrina Bultena, who was a grad student in my lab. She's currently an assistant professor at Radboud University Nijmegen in the Netherlands. So Sabrina studied intra-sentential code switching in Dutch-English bilinguals. So she presented them with sentences that started in the first language Dutch and then continued in their second language English, or the sentences started in their second language English and then continued in their first language Dutch. And then processing of these sentences, these code switch sentences, was compared to sentences that were fully in Dutch, so the first language, or sentences that were fully in English. So these sentences are the non-switched controls. So she conducted two different tasks. So she presented these sentences in a self-paced reading task, which is a comprehension task. So these words are, the sentences are basically presented word by word, and then the participant has to press the space bar in order to let pop up the next word, and then you can measure the reaction time. And in the second study, she used a shadowing task. So basically, participants listen to a sentence and then they're asked to shadow the sentence the moment the sentence starts. So this is a recording, an example of a code switch sentence presented to the participants.
Ans en Henk zochten al een jaar iets passends bij hun bankstel. Toen ze het na veel twijfelen eindelijk hadden gekocht, dit tapijt decorated the living room in their apartment.
So this is an example of a sentence that started in Dutch and then switched into English. Now, the next recording is actually a recording from a participant who listened to the sentence and then had to shadow the sentence.
Ans en Henk
Ans en Henk
zochten al een jaar
iets passends bij hun bankstel.
Toen ze het na veel
twijfelen eindelijk hadden gekocht,
dit
tapijt decorated the living room in their apartment.
So this is actually a horrible task to conduct as a participant because you get it's very cognitively effortful. But basically, what you're calculating is for the onset of each and every word in the second stream, the difference between when the original recording started, so the speaker, relative to when the participant started, and that's the delay times. And the idea is that if it's harder to follow along with the sentence, to process the sentence, the delay times will be longer. And we predicted that the delay times would be longer in the code switch sentence relative to the non-switch sentences. But the real question is, does that differ depending on switching direction? So what we found for the shadowing task, but also for the self-paced reading task that I will not present here today, but if you want to read these papers, the full references are here, that it was actually more effortful. So the switching costs were larger when switching from the first language to the second language, rather than the other way around. So this is opposite to what the isolated item switching studies found. So here you can see the data of the self-paced reading task, but the results for the switching, the shadowing task were the same. So I don't understand why. Okay, so the legend got lost here, but let me explain it. So the dotted line is the the dotted lines is the single language sentence, and the gray dotted lines is the Dutch single language sentence, and then the gray solid line is the sentence that switched from the first language into the second language. And then the same for, so the dotted line is stay in English, second language, and then the solid line is when the sentence switched from English into Dutch. And what you can see is that the switching cost is actually larger for sentences that switch into the second language relative to sentences that stayed in the same language. So the difference between the two gray lines on the critical switching word in this particular position is larger than the difference between the two black lines. So here you can see that again. So this is basically the difference between, so this is the switching cost when switching from the first to the second language, and the switching cost when switching from the second to the first language. And what you can see here is that at the switch location, it's actually more costly to switch from the first into the second language than to switch from the second into the first language. So again, that's opposite to the isolated item switching study, suggesting that switching in these isolated item studies may actually be something different from code switching in a full sentence. And how we explain these results is that basically the pattern of results, so that switching from the first to the second language takes longer than the other way around, reflects differences in second language proficiency. So these Dutch English bilinguals were more proficient in their first language than their second language. So when they switch into the second language, they switch into the language they're less proficient in. So this explanation doesn't necessarily require this inhibition assumption as in the isolated item studies. You can simply explain it by arguing that, yeah, if you're less proficient in your second language, it takes longer to switch into your second language. So what we concluded from this work is that the isolated item switching studies may tell us more about isolated item switching, but it doesn't necessarily, the findings cannot necessarily generalize to full sentence switching. More specifically, the switching costs that you observe in full sentence switching seem to depend on language dominance and are not so much driven by inhibition. And in a way that makes sense, because if you're processing a full sentence, you don't want to inhibit each and every incoming words, because when sentence processing is incremental, so you build up the sentence structure as the sentence unfolds itself. So you want to keep both of the language active in order to integrate these different languages later into your full sentential frame. But as I mentioned earlier, the switching cost in and of itself doesn't tell us a lot about the underlying mechanism. Well, if you compare switching from the one language to the other, and so if you compare switching directions, you can infer something, but you can't really pin down the specific cognitive mechanism associated with the switching costs. So the question that is driving the next studies I will present was asking to what extent measurements of brain activity can come to the rescue. Can they help us to identify the specific cognitive processes that are associated with intra-sentential code switching? So measurements of brain activity as recorded by electrophysiology can help us identify the time course of intra-sentential code switching. And these different components, I'll explain that more in a minute, that are associated with changes in neural activity of one senses versus the other, can tell us more about the nature of the cognitive processes that are involved in the comprehension of code switch sentences. So electrophysiology measures neural activity in the brain with millisecond precision. So it gives us a very good window onto what happens in time when the sentence unfolds itself. And in these studies, we focused on reading, but we also focused on listening when the speaker had a native-like accent in both languages, or actually, and when the speaker had a clearly identifiable accent in one of the languages. So the reading study was conducted in collaboration with my student, Caitlin Letkowski, who then moved on to be a postdoc at Northwestern University. And the listening studies have been conducted by Carla Fernandez, who is currently a postdoc at Duke University. So if you analyze the EEG recording and focus on event-related potentials. I don't have time to explain the whole thing, but what's important is to remember that there are two different ERP signatures that are associated with intra-sentential code switching. So basically, when the event-related potential technique looks into the ongoing recording of the neural signal and time locks the neural recording to the onset of a particular item, in this case, a particular word. And then you can see what happens over time as time goes by. Now, there are two different components that have been associated with intra-sentential code switching, the N400 and the LPC. The N400 is a negative going polarity that peaks at 400 milliseconds after the stimulus has been presented. And this particular component, and I'll have some examples in a minute, has been associated with lexical semantic access and activation. So basically, it's accessing word information. The late positive complex, the LPC, is a later component that peaks around 600-700 milliseconds. It's a positive going wave. And the occurrence of the LPC component has been associated with sentence level reanalysis and restructuring, or a reconfiguration of a task in a language set. Now, what the specific functional significance of these components is very often related to the task, but when we look at sentence level processing, then the LPC very often kicks in when there's, for example, an anomaly in the sentence, or a grammatical anomaly, or when the structure of the sentence changes. So basically, the comprehender has been processing along, and then suddenly the hierarchical structure that has been built up so far needs to be restructured because there is a grammatical error kicking in, or the sentence switched into the other language. So keep these two components in mind. So in the very first study that has been conducted using ERPs in sentence switching, code switching studies, has been conducted by Marino, Vedemaring, and Kudas. And they tested highly proficient English-Spanish bilinguals. And the question they posed was whether switching from the first to the second language, is that similar to staying in the first language, but then basically switching a particular word in that first language. So they had sentences that started like, each night the campers built a, and then the expected word in this particular case is fire. A lexical switch is basically a synonym of the word fire. So the word blaze fits into this sentence, but you would more expect the word fire to appear here. But blaze, actually works. Or a code switch, fuego, which is the translation of fire. So participants read the sentence, each night the campers built a, and then the sentence was concluded with one of these three words. So what they found basically is an N400 effect in response to the lexical switch. So you have to look a little bit carefully here, but this line, so this is the waveform associated with each night a sentence like each night the campers built a. Then in this particular case, what the expected word, so the word fire, doesn't do a lot in the brain because it's a totally expected word. The word blaze is a little bit more unexpected. So what you see happening here is that the brain picks up on the unexpectancy. So what you can see here is that there's a difference in the amplitude, so the y-axis indicates the amplitude, between the expected word fire and the unexpected word, or the lexical switch blaze, as well as between fire and the code switch fuego, which is the other dashed line, but I highlighted that in red. Now, if you look later into the signal, so this is the LPC time window, then you don't see anymore a difference between the lexical switch blaze and the expected word fire. But what you do see here is that there's an amplitude difference between the code switch fuego and the expected word. So what Marino concluded on the basis of this very early study is that a code switch may be a surprising event and thus elicit an LPC. It's not more difficult to process a code switch at the lexical semantic level because they also found an N400 in response to the lexical switch. So these are some other studies that have been conducted to study intra-sentential code switching using ERPs, and I added a reference to a review paper if you're really interested in this topic. But what you can see is that these three different studies were quite different in terms of the participants that they used, whether or not they looked at code switching from the first to the second language, from the second to the first, or in both directions. Code switching is, there are different ways in which you can code switch, and a lexical insertion is basically you have a sentence in one language and then there's only one word that switches in that particular sentence. And then the location of that word can be the final noun, as in these two different studies, or it can be somewhere in the middle of the sentence. Now, what's relevant for these studies is that you need to control for cognates, because cognates can actually help to co-activate these two different languages, but these early studies didn't necessarily control for cognates. So there are all kinds of differences between these studies that may actually explain why the findings are different as well. So why is this not working? The question that we addressed in this particular study published in Neuropsychology is there a switching difference between switching from the first to the second language relative to switching from the second to the first language? So in other words, do we see this asymmetry in code switching also reflected in intra-sentential code switching when you measure ERPs? And then the question is this cost driven by sentence level restructuring processes, or is it driven by local lexical semantic integration? Now, if the switching costs are driven by lexical semantic integration, so it's more difficult to integrate this switched word into the sentence, then we expect to find an N for 100. However, if these switching costs are driven by sentence level restructuring, so more at the sentence level rather than at the word level, then we expect to find an LPC. So in this particular study, we had Spanish-English bilinguals who who grew up with Spanish and then learned English at a later age. So these were all young adults. But what's not uncommon in Spanish-English bilinguals who live in the United States is that at some point, their proficiency in the second language, English, may actually be higher than in the first language. So a lot of Spanish-English bilinguals in the United States are so-called heritage speakers. So they learned Spanish in their home situation, but because they've been schooled in English, at some point, they are more proficient in their technically second language than they are in their first language. So when we test Spanish-English bilinguals in my lab, we always have an extensive battery of different language proficiency tests, because we want to make sure which language they're actually more proficient in, because they will all tell you that Spanish is their first language, but when you actually measure their proficiency in Spanish and English, then for about half of them in this particular study, but that's not uncommon, they're more proficient in English. So rather than indicating them their proficiency by the language they learned first, we actually indicate that we categorize them as more dominant in one language versus more weak in the other language. Then for some people, the dominant language is actually Spanish, and then for other people, the dominant language is actually English. And in this particular participant group, about half the people, the participants, dominant language was Spanish, and then for the other half, it actually was English. But what you can see is that, they were both highly proficient, but by and large, they were more proficient in self-rated production measure, self-rated comprehension measure, Boston picture naming accuracy, lexical decision accuracy, lexical decision reaction time, a sentence reading task, in terms of how fast they were reading the sentence and how well they understood the sentence. These are the sentences that we used. So I don't speak Spanish, so I'll skip that part. But we basically had sentences that started in English and then switched into Spanish. So these were the sentences with a code switch. And then we had the very same sentence, but then the sentence just stayed in English. We also had sentences that started in Spanish and then switched into English. And we had sentences, the control sentences, that stayed in Spanish. So these are all, every type of sentence had 4 different versions. They started in English, switched into Spanish, remained in English all the way, started in Spanish, switched in English, or remained in Spanish all the way. Oh, that was too fast. We used, in this particular reading study, a rapid serial visual presentation, which is a very common presentation mode in EEG studies. So basically, each word was presented for 300 milliseconds, followed by a 200 millisecond blank screen. And then in about a quarter of the sentences, we added comprehension questions, because, you know, technically, if you're reading these sentences, we want to make sure that people stayed alert. So that's why we included occasionally comprehension questions, just to make sure that people would remain paying attention. And then halfway the sentence, there's a code switch. So unlike the sentences that had been used in these previous code switching studies using ERPs, where they used a lexical insertion, so basically only one word that switched in the sentence and then the sentence went back to the original language, we had a full switch to the other language. So the sentence started in one language and then switched in full to the other language. And if you so corpus studies have actually found that in this particular population, a full switch to the other language is actually more common than just a single item being switched in a sentence. So in a way, you could argue that these sentences are more ecologically valid than the isolated item insertion studies. So here are the results. So what I present here is so when you're measuring EEG ERP responses, we're using over 30 electrodes, but you can categorize them into different areas. And each of the specific components has a unique configuration. So the LPC, for example, tends to be more pronounced in the central parietal area. So these are the frontal electrodes, average across the frontal electrodes, left frontal, left parietal, right parietal, and then this is the midline. So it's the front electrode here, the central electrode, and the parietal electrode. And the same for the other switching direction. So these are the ERP responses to sentences that started in the bilingual's dominant language and then switched into their weakened language. And what we found was a modulation of the LPC. So the switched sentences are indicated with the yellow, it's not yellow, the red waveform, and the non-switched sentences are black and dashed. And what you can see is that the LPC is more pronounced for the sentences that switched from the dominant to the weaker language relative to the sentences that stayed in one language, non-switched sentences. Whereas if you look at the other way, so switching from the weaker to the dominant language, we didn't find any modulation of the ERP components. So none of these differences between the red waveform and the dashed waveform were significant. And this is basically called the butterfly model. So this represents the different positions of these electrodes. So in addition to measuring event-related potentials, there's also another way in which you can look into the neural signal. And again, I'm not going into details because this would require over an hour to fully explain it. But you can also look at the oscillatory dynamics of the EEG signal. And the technique to do that is time-frequency analysis. So basically, a time-frequency analysis reflects the ongoing event-related synchronization or desynchronization in functional neural networks. But what's relevant for to know is that pretty much like you can have different ERP components, you can also have different patterns of synchronization or desynchronization in different frequency bands. So an EEG signal can be decomposed into different frequency bands, and each of these frequency bands has a particular functional significance, so reflects a particular cognitive process. So modulations in the theta frequency band, for example, have been associated with lexicosemantic processing pretty much as the N400 has been associated with. So in a way, if you look at EEG signal from the ERP perspective, then the N400 reflects something similar as the theta oscillations or the theta power changes in the time frequency analysis. Likewise, changes in the beta frequency band have been associated with sentence level integration and reanalysis. So effects, so power changes in the beta frequency bands have been associated with sentence level structure building and sort of unification, integration, or a change in the construction at the sentence level. So power changes in the beta frequency bands are functionally similar to the ERP component, the LPC. So what we found when sentences switched from the dominant to the weaker language, in the ERP components, we had found a modulation of the LPC, indicating sentence level reanalysis and reintegration. Here in time frequency analysis, we actually found a mirror pattern, but then in the frequency band. So we found that there was a lower beta power decrease for switched as compared to non-switched words from 3 to 600 milliseconds. Basically from, it started out in the posterior sides here, and then it moved so this is actually a person's nose. So it started at the posterior sides, and then as time moved on, the power changes moved all the way to the more frontal sides. So the key finding here is that power changes in the beta frequency band have been associated with sentence level integration and reanalysis, and that basically parallels the ERP component LPC that we also found when the sentence switched from participants' dominant language to their weaker language. Now, what happens in the other way around? There we found when the sentence switched from the weaker to the dominant language, we found a theta power increase over 300 to 600 milliseconds post-stimulus onset over the right frontal and then more to the central electrode sides. Also here, the changes in the theta power frequency band have been associated with lexical semantic integration, and the ERP components also demonstrated an N400 modulation when the sentence switched from the weaker to the dominant language. So if we summarize these findings, then when the sentence switched from the dominant to the weaker language, we observed a modulation of the ERP LPC component and a power decrease in the lower beta frequency band that both indicate that switching impacts sentence level restructuring mechanisms. Whereas switching from the weaker to the dominant language, there we observed no ERP effect, but we did observe a theta component. And these two findings combined indicate that switching from the weaker to the dominant language is sort of a combination of lexical semantic and word level inhibition processes. So in other words, switching costs from the dominant to the weaker language seem to be more associated with sentence level restructuring, whereas switching from the weak to the dominant language seems to be more affecting the word level processing. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this pattern, this study, and move on to. So basically, in this particular study that I went through real quickly in the interest of time, we used the very same sentences, but rather than testing Spanish, English bilinguals in the United States, who are all habitual code switchers, so they code switch very frequently, Caitlin Litkowski went to Spain. I'm trying to remember, to Teresa Bajo's lab in, why am I blanking out on the name? There's the Alhambra. It'll come back. Anyway, so the Spanish English bilinguals that she recruited there were non-habitual code switchers. So they were very proficient in English, but they didn't code switch on a day-to-day basis. But basically, she found the very same effect. So when the sentence switched from their dominant to their weaker language, which in their case was always from Spanish to English, she observed a modulation of the LPC. And when they were switching from the weak to the dominant language, she also observed a theta power increase and N for 100. So this finding basically corroborates the earlier effects that we found in habitual code switchers. Now, you may think, well, switching so code switching is a discourse phenomena. So code switching tends to occur when people talk to each other and not so much when they're reading sentence materials. Now, my students will actually tell you, well, actually my advisor, when she gives feedback on my paper, there's actually quite a bit of code switching going on. So, you know, when it's late, when I'm working late at night and I'm a little bit tired, then sometimes in my comments, Dutch words appear, and then my students are always the ones who don't speak Dutch are always very sweet. They go online and Google and then figure out what a Dutch word may have meant. But, you know, by and large, code switching is more a discourse phenomenon than that it occurs in reading. But actually, a lot of the psycholinguistic and neurocognitive studies have used reading as the reading as the modality that they use to study code switching in. So Carla Fernandez, who is who code switches herself a lot, wanted to see to what extent the neurocognitive mechanisms that we observe in reading code switch sentences are the same when you're listening to code switch sentences that are produced without an accent. But she was particularly interested in what may happen when people have an accent. So the reality is that the majority of bilinguals have an accent in one of the languages. And it may be the case that listeners are using this accent to then help them to process code switch speech. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that study later, but first we need to figure out what happens when this switch sentences are presented auditorily. Because for those of you who conduct ERP analysis, conducting ERP analysis with auditory presented material is a completely different beast. So, because with ERPs, you basically have to time lock to the onset of a particular word. You can imagine that if you have this word by word presentation on the screen, that's very easy, right? Because you know when the words are being presented on the screen. But if you have an ongoing speech signal, then determining what the onset of the word is actually a big challenge. So for these studies, we first record speech, then we go into acoustics analysis software like Praat, for example, and then by hand we have to mark the onset of a particular word in this ongoing speech signal in order to be able to then time lock the onset of the recording of neural activity to the onset of the word. So it's much more work to conduct auditory EEG, but at the same time, it also creates many additional opportunities. For example, because you are able to manipulate the accent of the speaker and see to what extent that modulates code switching costs. But before going into the real stuff with the accent, we first have to figure out what are the ERP components associated with listening to code switched sentences? Because they're not necessarily the same as the ERP components that you observe when people are reading sentences. Okay, I think I already said this. So yes, listening to code switch speech may elicit different ERP components because, when you're reading, it goes a little bit slower. Whereas if you're definitely with these RSVP methodology in which each word is presented 300 milliseconds after the other word. In auditory speech, it's a whole speech signal. So it requires different attentional processes, and it may also elicit different ERP components. In this study, we tested Spanish-English bilinguals who, again, were recruited in the United States. So they were, from the larger Latinx Hispanic community. Again, we classified them as being more dominant in one language relative to the other language. And for about half of them, Spanish was still their dominant language, whereas for the other half, English was the dominant language. Again, we conducted all kinds of proficiency measures in order to determine their proficiency level. We basically had the very same sentence materials as we had used in the previous studies. So sentences that switched or did not switch, and the switch sentences switched from English to Spanish or from Spanish to English, or stayed in English or stayed in Spanish. So here are the ERP results. So when the sentences switched from the dominant to the weaker language, we observed a modulation of the LPC. So these are the switched, the red waveforms are the switched sentences. The blue waveforms are the non-switched sentences. So this switched from the dominant to the weaker language, and they were compared to staying in the dominant language. Whereas if the sentence switched from the weaker to the dominant language, we observed a modulation of the N400, suggesting that when sentences switch from the dominant to the weaker language, pretty much as in the reading studies, this seems to affect sentence level integration, whereas if a sentence switches from the weak to the dominant language, it modulates lexical level components. Now, this pattern was pretty much replicated in the time frequency analysis. So when the sentence switched from the dominant to the weaker language, again, we observed a beta power modulation, pretty much as in the reading sentences. Whereas when the sentence switched from the weaker to the dominant language, we, in this particular case, found a modulation of alpha power. Now, basically, alpha power modulations have been associated with increased listening efforts, which is not surprising because, you know, if you're listening to a code switch sentence and at the moment the sentence switched to the other language, you have to put in additional attentional processes, and that is reflected in alpha power modulation. So that's a pretty common component, which we argue is more specific to the modality that we used rather than to code switching mechanisms per se. So if we put this all together, then we see the following pattern. So when the modality is reading, but also when the modality is listening to sentences that switch from the dominant to the weaker language, we basically find LPC effects across the board. And for the time frequency analysis, decreases in the beta power frequency band. All these patterns suggest that the switching is related to sentence level restructuring and reanalysis mechanisms. And we observe that both in listening to code switch sentences as well as reading code switch sentences. However, when we look at the other switching direction, when the sentence switches from the weaker to the dominant language, then we observe N400s or theta power, and in this particular case, alpha power increases, which is more modality specific. But by and large, this pattern seems to suggest that when people are switching when the sentence switches from the weaker to the dominant language, we observe switching related modulation of word level information. And you know what it means in the larger scale, I'll come back to that in the discussion. Okay, so that's for listening to code switch sentences that are produced by speakers who don't have an observable accent. And, you know, we measured that beforehand, of course. Now, the question is, what happens when the speaker has an accent? Can listeners use this particular accent in order to modulate their code switching, to sort of facilitate the comprehension of code switch speech? And in particular, we were wondering to what extent Spanish accented English may facilitate the comprehension of a subsequent switch into Spanish. So, for example, you're a Spanish-English bilingual and you're listening to the following sentence. Greg put some pencils on his, and then it switches into Spanish. But when you present this particular sentence, when you produce this particular sentence with a Spanish accent, then basically what happens at the beginning of the sentence is that both English through the sentence and Spanish through the accent are being activated. Now, the co-activation of Spanish in this particular case, because the speaker is a Spanish native speaker and has a Spanish accent, speaks Spanish accented English, may actually help the comprehender to understand the switch, because you're listening to this sentence, Spanish and English are both co-activated. And then, processing Spanish at this point, at the switching location, is going to be easier because your Spanish is already co-activated, right? Whereas if the Spanish accented speaker starts a sentence in Spanish, then the Spanish accent doesn't have, that is just a native language, and then switches into English, then that will have a different effect. There's no way, it's not going to be very likely that comprehending the switch into English has already been co-activated, because everything is Spanish at the beginning of the sentence. Okay, so we use that thinking to see to what extent listeners, because in accented speech, the the two languages are co-activated, whether then comprehending the switch is not so costly anymore. And then the most critical comparison is when the sentence is produced in English with a Spanish accent and then switches into Spanish. So if there's no accent, then the previous study demonstrated that we see an N400 modulation. But then the question is, when this sentence is produced with a Spanish accent, do we then see that there's an attenuation of the N400 component? So is this N400 component smaller, indicating that the listener has an easier time comprehending the switch into Spanish? Whereas in the other direction, when switching from Spanish first language to English, we don't expect a modulation here, because the Spanish accent at the beginning of the sentence will not help you to then comprehend the English part. So we had 8 different conditions in this particular study, and the sentences were recorded by 2 non-accented Spanish-English bilinguals and 2 accented Spanish-English bilinguals, and the bilinguals all had a Spanish accent in English. So here is an example. Let me make sure that I'm doing that.
Greg put some pencils on his escritorio en cuanto llegó a clase.
That's the full Spanish sentence. Let me see. No, actually, that's the right one. Sorry. So it starts in English. Greg put some pencils on his, and then it continues into Spanish. But the first part of the English sentence is produced with a Spanish accent. This is actually Carla Fernandez, her voice.
Greg put some pencils on his escritorio en cuanto llegó a clase.
Now the question is, if you're a Spanish-English bilingual and you're listening to this particular sentence, because the sentence, even though it starts in English, is produced with a Spanish accent, both your Spanish and English have been co-activated. Then when the sentence switches into Spanish, it should be, is our prediction, easier to then process the Spanish part of the sentence, because Spanish had already been co-activated. Now the question is, that's the hypothesis that we tested. So in this particular experiment, we again tested Spanish-English bilinguals who were tested in their English and Spanish proficiency. Here we actually did go by language, because if you're manipulating the accented speech, then you need to make sure that you can't just go by dominant and weaker. So here we went by language, but we made sure that the proficiency levels in the 2 different languages were as close as possible, because we could no longer go by dominant and weak. So these are the results when sentences are produced without an accent and they switch from English to Spanish. here what we observed was a switch-related N400. So that's pretty similar, and that's pretty much similar to what we'd seen in all the other experiments. Now the question is, what happens with this N400 when the sentence is produced with a Spanish accent? You can't see it very clearly here, but what we observed statistically is that the N400 is actually smaller in this particular sentence than in sentences that were produced without an accent. So when the sentence switches from English to Spanish and the first part is presented with a Spanish accent, then the switch-related N400 is actually attenuated relative to the condition in which the first part of the sentence is not produced with an accent. So here's another way of presenting that. So what we did here was for each of these the critical regions in the of the ERP data, we calculated the N400 for the accented sentence, and we calculated the N400, the magnitude, for the non-accented sentence. And what you can see is that in all cases, the N400 for the non-accented sentences is larger than for the accented sentences in most of the time windows. In most of the regions of interests. In other words, when the first part of the sentence, the English part, is produced with a Spanish accent, then the switch-related N400 is smaller relative to when the first part is not produced with an accent, suggesting that it will be easier for the listener to then lexically semantically integrate the switch, the first word of the switched part, when the sentence has been produced by with an accent. So listening to Spanish accented English sentences that then switch into Spanish attenuates the costs of having to process the switch. And then when we look in the other direction, in which the accent doesn't really matter, we again observe the LPC effect in both conditions. Remember, so this is switching from the dominant to the weaker language, where we observe this switching cost in the LPC time window. So if we bring this all together, then the different studies that we've conducted, where sensory produced in reading or in a listening task, when the sentence switched from the dominant to the weaker language, basically in all cases, we observed a modulation of the LPC, and we didn't conduct time frequency analysis yet on the extended speech study. But where we did conduct time frequency analysis, we also observed a modulation of beta power, in both indicating that the switch is associated with a change at the sentence level structure, so sentence level restructuring and reanalysis. Whereas if we look at sentences switch from the weaker to the dominant language, then we observed an N400 modulation, corroborated with a theta power change. However, when the first part of the sentence was produced with an accent, the same accent of the language the sentence then switched into, we observed that the N400 was modulated. So apparently listeners do take can benefit from a sentence being produced in an accent, because they co-activate their two different languages, which then modulates the switching cost. So the overall conclusions, if we bring this all together, then what these studies suggest, that both in reading as well as in listening, when people are comprehending sentences that switch from the dominant to the weaker language, this seems to be driven by sentence level restructuring. So one way to look at this is to assume that bilinguals, when they're listening or reading code switch speech, continues to have to adjust the activation of the two languages, or in any case, basically. But when they are listening to a sentence that switches from the dominant to the weaker language, what they've done is that they first build up this sentence structure in the dominant language. And then the sentence switches into the weaker language. They then have to basically bring in the structure of the weaker language into this hierarchy that I have already been building up. So they recruit sentence level restructuring processes in order to integrate this weaker language into the sentence structure they've been building up on the basis of the dominant language. However, when the sentence switches from the weaker into the dominant language, that's more driven by semantic access and word level integration. So, and this actually goes a little bit back to the isolated item studies. One way to look at this is that when you're reading or listening to a sentence in your weaker language, you actually need to suppress your more dominant language. And then when you encounter a switch from the weaker to the dominant language, you need to release this word level inhibition of the dominant language when you're confronted with a switch into the weaker language. And this seems particularly challenging when you're listening to code switch sentences. So basically, the sentence starts out in your weaker language, suggesting that you, in order to build up this sentence structure, you have to inhibit your first language because this one's begging for activation. But then when the sentence switches into your dominant language, you know, you at the word level, you have to release this inhibition in order to process a sentence further. And then when the first part of the sentence is actually produced with an accent, then that facilitates the comprehension of the switch into the language of the accent. So the take-home message, I hope I've convinced you that EEG approaches, and keep in mind, this is a fairly new area of research. So we're basically only figuring out how it all works using this particular approach. But these approaches can help us to understand the nature, the cognitive nature of switching cost and the cognitive processes that are recruited when listeners or readers are comprehending code switched sentences. It also demonstrates that in order to understand the code switching phenomenon more generally, we need to have both linguistic studies as well as psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic or neurocognitive studies in order to understand what's going on when people are producing or comprehending code switched speech. So this is the end of what I would like to share today. So I would like to thank Sabrina Bultena, Gerrit-Jan Koolstra, Kate Litkowski, and Carla Fernandez, who are all former or current students in my lab who have contributed to these code switching studies. I would also, like to do a shout out to my current and former postdocs, as well as current and former graduate students, because they've all contributed to this type of research when we were discussing, for example, these studies during our weekly lab meetings. And I would also like to thank the funding agencies who, in particular NSF, who has made this research possible. So I also put some references here in case you're interested in this topic and would like to know more about it. Then you're in luck, because very recently great special issues came out on code switching. So there's a very recent special issue in Frontiers in Psychology that has brought together 19 different articles that are all focusing on behavioral and neurocognitive or neurophysiological approaches to code switching and language switching. So code switching, sentential code switching, language switching, isolated item switching. And there's also a special issue in linguistic approaches to bilingualism that more closely discusses different methodologies that have been used in psycholinguistic research on intra-sentential code switching. And that particular special issue contains 6 different articles that discuss more in depth which psycholinguistic or neurocognitive methodologies can be used to understand intra-sentential code switching. So this is what I would like to share today. And I think I need to stop share now so that we go back to the Zoom.
And Janet, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation, very interesting experiments. And I asked the audience if they have questions, and no, we have no questions so far.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much once again for
Okay.
joining this series, and I welcome everybody to continue watching Bilingual Vivo series. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again for inviting me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.